Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast, where we are peeling back the layers of the financial industry like an onion. Now, hopefully with fewer tears today, we're diving into a story that's part David versus Goliath, part how to crash a party where you weren't invited. We're talking about Capitec Bank, the scrappy upstart that quietly stalked South Africa's banking giants while they, napped. And when they woke up, it was too late. Capitec had already helped itself to a rather large slice of the banking market. The golden laying egg, the harp, whatever you want to call it. If you're TJ Strydom, the author, the metaphors run thick through the book. And I'm really looking forward to having you on the podcast, TJ, to talk about what is just an absolutely gripping story, where just when you strip away all the layers, a story of real innovation, but simplicity at its core. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me. I usually enjoy the podcasts more than anyone else, so thanks so much. I'm glad I'm finally on it.
Someone else other than my mom and Monocle listened to the podcast, and we found him. TJ Strydom, thank you so much.
That's me.
Very kind of you. I've got to ask you, I mean, you've now written 3 books about the Stellenbosch business elite. I'm not going to call them the Stellenbosch mafia because they're not mafia. Koos Becker's Billions, which was your most recent one, Christo Visa Risk and Riches in 2019. I know you studied at Stellies and you wrote a book called Wortel about it, but are you related? Are you like a second nephew twice removed or something of Christo Visa's? What's the fascination with Stellenbosch?
So, no relation. And as you say, these were unauthorized books, all of them. So I'm obviously fascinated by them just because I think I sort of understand the world they're from. I spent probably longer than I should have at Stellenbosch. But I do sort of get that they were all in university residences together. Well, not together, but at sort of around the same time. So I think I've got a bit of an idea of that world they were in. And you could probably call it some sort of an accelerated networking system that they were part of. And I just don't think it's as dubious as, calling it a mafia. I think it's just sort of an ancient version of LinkedIn. That's more the way I think about it. But the reason I'm also interested in them is because they were pretty successful with quite strange business models. I mean, Koos is Mnet. That's fascinating story. Goes to Pep, which is a fascinating story, and then Capitec.
No, there's something in the drinking water down there. It's the networking, as you say. It's birthed, if you look at the Rupert Empire as well, just some of the most extraordinary South African businesses. And even amongst all of those extraordinary businesses, Capitec's growth really stands out. And we'll get into it. I just want to say, Stellenbosch a little bit longer. I mean, you say probably took a bit longer than you should have. It sounds like my passage through Rao, which was for a SOTI, not the traditional way one goes to study journalism, but I paid for it myself. I worked up and down 7th Avenue in Melville, and I really enjoyed my student years. How would you say that period shaped you as a financial journalist?
Well, it probably forced me into financial journalism in the end. I actually first thought I'd be an actuary. Then I thought I'd be a lawyer. And eventually I ended up doing the 1-year course there in Stellenbosch, the postgrad in journalism, and ended up at Beeld. And I think the thing is I did a BCom. Economics was my major. So it's always sort of been the basis of the way I look at the world.
Yeah.
And I think it probably helped make me literate to reading lots of good financial media. And I think that's probably more what helped and more what shaped it than anything in Stellenbosch. I think if you read the Finansies en Techniek in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was really an extraordinary piece of journalism. And I think the same was definitely true of Financial Mail around that time. And you get a lot from that. And then some of the people that worked there and some of the ways that they present stories to me, that was sort of the thing that made me want to be a financial journalist.
Did you have any mentors in your career? I mean, I'm always very grateful to my late mentor, David Gleeson, who acquired Finance Week at one stage, had the talk column running in various publications, but he kind of took me in straight after graduation and basically told me everything I'd learned was wrong and kind of rebuilt it from the ground up, taught me how to read a balance sheet. But, he was so critical in shaping me as a financial journalist. And I'm curious on the subject before we talk about Capitec, because I think the state of financial journalism is not where it should be in South Africa. And we as kind of senior, and I consider you a very well-respected senior financial journalist, we should be worried about that.
I think we definitely should be worried. And I think part of the problem is it's almost like the middle has been hollowed out. So you get some very, very senior financial journalists and then some juniors coming in. But I learned most, I'm actually not going to mention anyone by name, but I learned most from some of my colleagues who were just between 5 and 10 years older than I was, because they had time to chat to you while you were at the water cooler, or back then the smoking room, or something similar. And I think that's where I learned most. Almost an informal mentorship, I'd say. When you ask me about formal, like a real mentor, I think probably it's far away, but Michael Lewis, though I've never met him, I mean, just reading
Flash
the way
Boys.
he approached, exact Flash Boys, Liar's Poker, incredible way of telling a story. And I mean, for any financial journalist, that's very useful. And I didn't know early on that I was going to write, but now as a writer, it's an incredible way to present something that could be inaccessible and present it in a very accessible way. So that's the long and the short answer.
Well, I mean, and you've done this with Capitec, even for those who are not finance, banking, or economics nerds like I would consider us to be. I mean, that's a very accessible read. And you go all the way back to kind of the initial ideas or birth of the micro lending cash loan business industry, from kind of peanuts to profits with the Fourie brothers and their early experiments in cash loans. And then you mentioned Derek Keyes and the decision to deregulate small loans under 6,000. Just take us back to that moment and how significant this regulatory change was for the development of Capitec and the micro lending industry at large.
Yeah, I think without the micro-lending industry, there was probably no Capitec. Capitec bought themselves, in effect, they bought themselves a distribution network by acquiring lots of these cash loan shops, or loan sharks, if you want to call it loan sharks. They bought up something like 300 just to start off with. And yeah, it was Derek Keyes, it was a bit of deregulation. The Usury Act wasn't really working, so especially for small loans in South Africa. And the idea was obviously to get large financial institutions to sort of grease the wheels of commerce. And there was an exemption notice to the Usury Act. I think it was end of 92, so it would have started in 1993. And no one took notice. At least the big banks didn't implement it. But, you'd never think of it. But there were some entrepreneurs in Limpopo who just saw the opportunity. And they came up with the idea of the card and PIN system. And that became the industry standard. So very quickly, something like, I think I do mention it in the book, but it turned from one shop to two, and then to 1,500, and then thousands of cash loan shops. And it was really the first time that lots of people in South Africa got exposed to financial services. I mean, South Africa has this past of financial exclusion, and it was the first time that the majority of South Africans could sit on the other side of a desk and have a conversation with someone about their money.
Usurious interest rates, 30%
Absolutely.
a month, and that later came down to 30% a year. And there were further regulatory screws that were tightened on the business as we get into in the latest stages. But, in those early years, I think the Fouries and the early associates seemed to build a very unique business culture. It was around efficiency, it was around innovation. And I think much of that culture remains in Capitec today. How do you think that influenced the early genesis of the Capitec story, this looking at the landscape saying, well, there's a huge market demand. There's a need here in the new South Africa for credit. But the way the incumbents, the giants, as you call them, using the Jack and the Beanstalk analogy through the book, viewed that market was almost with disdain.
Yeah, I think the personal contact was the real thing that they latched onto. And I think the big banks, by that stage, they'd sort of forgotten how to really do that. I mean, you'd obviously remember, we're sort of the same generation. It was bulletproof glass in a bank. There was this divide between the teller and client. It was a long table with, forms that you had to fill in. That kind of thing obviously is intimidating to any new client. Especially can you imagine if you are the first person in your family to want to open a bank account, and this is what you meet there? So I think that personal contact is sort of the very, very secret sauce that Capitec got from them. And then another thing that I actually, only after the book did I really realize that the other thing that they got from microlending is the microlenders had to go and withdraw the money from ATMs late at night on the day that client got paid, like a preferred debit order of sorts, a very manual version of that. And Capitec latched onto that idea. So they, in a very electronic way, in a very advanced way, they withdraw or they deduct the money first if there's a loan. And I think that was very clever. And it's something that they built on. And it was just also not something that the other banks were necessarily aware of. But personal service, I think, that was their secret sauce at a time when the other banks, they were thinking of other things.
Yeah. And I mean, for later on in the book, you relay a story about how in the early years of Capitec, and still to this day, if you chat to a Harry Fourie, or back then it was Rian Starson, they would go out, they would walk the streets, they would kick the bricks. And it was in one of those sessions that I think Rian Starson, I can't remember who he was with, but he had a look at this queue around an ATM and he saw that people were transacting twice, once to see the balance and then to transact. And he said, wait a minute, we can improve this and we can innovate around this system. Why don't we just flash their balance on initially? It's a great example of that kind of innovative thinking.
Exactly. And client-centric thinking. And obviously now it looks so obvious, but none of the other banks thought of that. They were more interested in, maybe we charge the guy for the balance inquiry and, but Capitec sort of latched onto the idea of how the clients think. And I think the real genesis of that is obviously also where Capitec's management, plenty of them had roots in the liquor industry. And I think that sort of client contact and designing a product that's supposed to be bought and consumed and used, as opposed to thinking that people will come and buy whatever you have. I mean, I think the financial services industry was a bit trapped in that idea that, there are many takers for the things we offer by the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, yeah. And also a focus, while you relay the story of capitalizing this bank and how difficult it was initially for, I think it was multifactorial, there's a stigma around who they were and loan sharks and just a conservative environment. But then PSG did come in and sold out. And then Yanni Mouton realized that he had made a bit of a mistake here and then bought back in. But Mouton always used to say, why don't we go and sell another funeral policy on top of the Global One account that we do. And the management were laser focused. They were not going to sell potatoes in the banking hall. How important was that focus to its core in the early days?
No, it was absolutely vital. I think if you started selling airtime or funeral policies in Capitec branches early on, I think it would have just looked like a sales operation and not that focused, actually trying to get people to use banking services or trying to get people to be sure that they can afford the loans that they take out. And so I think I do say it in the book. It was about 15 years that they just had the savings account and the microloans. And only then, 15 or 16 years in, did they launch a credit card. And then pretty soon after that, they actually did go into funeral policies, but from a much higher base. So they didn't try to sell to, a few 100,000 people. Then they had several million clients that they could sell to. And one of the interesting things that, I think it was Harry Fourie who told me that Capitec sort of has this target that they want 30% market share in something before they move on to the next thing. I think they got very close to that in savings accounts. They were very close to that by the time they actually moved on to the next thing. But you can't do that without focus. They just knew their client so well, and I think they knew the needs of that client.
So often when you look at why businesses fail, it's because they lose focus. It sounds trite, but you have a management team, CFO is brought on by the CEO to focus on the next shiny M&A deal or the next strategic project, whatever business management consultant speak they call it, and they lose focus on the core, working capital, managing the cash flow of the business, the core functions. And I think often businesses hit the wall because they want to grow too quickly into too many different adjacent verticals. And there's a huge lesson for entrepreneurs in this. And that's what I love about the book. The lessons in building Capitec are applicable, I think, across industries. And that is choosing to focus that simplicity before you've got the scale to take on other ambitious projects and not get indigestion from them.
An interesting part to that is, I think had Capitec not had such a narrow focus, the other banks might have taken it more seriously early on. But they thought it was a losing project because, how's Capitec going to make money from a regular old savings account? How is it going to work? And I think a part of the things that ailed the financial sector in South Africa, especially the big banks, is they cross-subsidized their businesses. So a savings account wasn't necessarily a profitable thing for one of the big banks. They had to make it up with penalty fees here or something else in another business division. And the fact that Capitec could have a single product that actually made it money was bizarre, and at a very low cost point. That's the other thing. They said they only launch a product if they can be 40 or 50% cheaper than anything else in the market. And that I found fascinating. So they make a profit and they're half price. So how do you compete against that? I think that to me was fascinating. And all of that comes back to they designed something to be scalable and simple.
Technology was a big part of that, and it's obviously in the name, and you go through how they arrived at the name, but obviously it's capital and technology, portmanteau, Capitec, remove the H, it looks great. But they were a little bit lucky in that they got a really good tech team because of the downfall of, what was it, BOE at the time?
Yeah, BOE, small banks crisis, 2002. So Capitec was founded in 2001. Some of the micro lenders had been in the PSG stable since the late 90s. But yeah, when BOE was essentially taken over or rescued or forcibly merged into Nedbank, BOE, NBS, and Boland Bank were sort of in the same stable, and it became this big amorphous banking group that wasn't really focused.
Christo Visser was actually trying to put together, wasn't it?
Exactly. So, I mean, some of that research actually started with my first book. So
fascinating.
I could plagiarize myself there for a few pages. But the fascinating thing is, obviously, Nedbank, like all of the financial sector or all of the banking sector, was located in Joburg. And they just said, we're going to centralize everything to our head office. And the IT team of Boland Bank, where Michiel and Rian Stassen and lots of the other executives worked before starting Capitec, that IT team just didn't want to move back to Joburg, or didn't want to move to Joburg. I mean, semigration is not a recent phenomenon. I mean, if someone is settled in the Cape, don't get them up to Joburg very quickly.
The Escapetonians, as Michiel refers to them.
Escapetonians, yeah. And then the fascinating thing is, and this was obviously a masterstroke by Rian Stassen. He got the IT guy they knew at Boland, Chris Oosthuizen, to join them early on. And Chris could then actually recruit from all of, that sort of IT crack unit they had next to the Bergrivier there in Paul. Fascinating. For Nedbank, it wouldn't even have moved the needle. I mean, they had, I think I said in the book, they had access to all of the IT expertise of the greater Gauteng.
Talk to me about Michiel de Roux and how much access you got to him. We share one thing in common in that we both hail from Alberton. I'm more from LA, Lower Alberton. I grew up in Brackendowns, but he's a product of Alberton High. My claim to fame was scoring a try against Alberton High at my matric here, but I always get ribbed about where I came from, and then I remind people Michiel de Roux came from Alberton. He hasn't done too badly, but he's a notoriously shy billionaire. How did you get access?
So I just asked him to talk to me about Capitec and not about personal stuff, and he was more than happy to do that. I obviously got a bit of background on him through other sources, but yeah, he was quite open to talk about the bank and building the bank and the ideas around it. I had probably one or two proper nice interviews with him, but he was open enough that I could ask him a question here or there in between. But yeah, it's if you go and look for a photo of him on the internet, you'll find something that's pretty old. And he's not the only product of Alberton in the book. There's actually Chris Otto was just a year behind him.
Yes.
And yeah, also was called Alberton. And I found it quite fascinating. And I didn't include it in the book, but I just, obviously for some background, I went and read the Rand Daily Mail's matric results. You can sort of figure out when they're going to publish the matric results. So I went back and looked at the time, and I found a lovely article about Michiel where they talked to his mother. And I checked the next year's one you can actually check on microfilm at the National Library. You can go check it out.
Yeah.
And Chris Otto. He, the next year, did incredibly well, like 6 distinctions. And then I asked him, how do you feel about these 6 distinctions of yours? He says, I'm actually quite surprised that I didn't get 7. I don't know what happened to woodwork. I thought that was fascinating.
It shows you the level of research that's gone into this book. I did find it very well researched, meticulously researched, and also annotated as well and referenced. So there's lots in the book that you can then go and have a look at and read up. But there's a decent sprinkling of luck. I mean, yes, you talk about the technology, the core focus, the going back to basics, the just seeing what the incumbents didn't see at the time. But I wasn't aware that they narrowly dodged doing a deal with Ellerines before Abel acquired them. Imagine how the Capitec story would have turned out if they did do the Ellerines deal just shortly before it went belly up.
Yeah, hectic. That part I thought was quite interesting, and they don't make too much a deal of it, but they were in discussions with Ellerines, and they're quite vague about whether they just wanted to buy the book or whether they wanted to buy the business. And so from what I gather, it was still quite early stages, but they were ready to sit around a table and talk money. Yeah, and I think if we talk about focus, there you had African Bank, who was probably the strongest in that microlending market. It had an incredible brand, and it just completely lost the plot by buying Ellerines. Suddenly they were selling furniture along with microloans. And African Bank was, I mean, it was poised to actually, if it went into transactional banking, it could have probably snuffed out Capitec, or it would have been an interesting fight.
Yeah.
But yeah, they just lost it. And when we talk about luck, so yeah, missed Ellerines. Thank goodness for them. They got through the global financial crisis looking quite smart, because that sort of penny pinching idea of a recession in South Africa, it really brought the banking cost fight to the fore.
Yeah.
And I think they totally gained lots of clients there. And then they were lucky actually when African Bank failed. African Bank's failure in 2014 just opened up the micro-lending market in a different way. And, one of the other things, and I don't know if I mention it that pertinently as a lucky stroke, but for them, the regulation that came in, so we spoke about the deregulation and sort of that almost a decade that there wasn't that much scrutiny, and that really led to the establishment of this micro-lending industry.
Yeah, it was the Wild West.
Yeah, it was the Wild West. And then the National Credit Act came in. And suddenly it evened the playing field for everyone. And Capitec was, I know they complained about it, all these regulations and this and that, but they were very clever in the way they approached that. And I think it actually in the end helped them quite a lot, because I think it flushed out a lot of the bad actors in that business.
Yeah.
So if you look at that, and I'm not selling the book very well now, but it's because it sounds a lot like regulation and capital adequacy and this and that. But the funny thing is, Capitec it's a thing that has quite a bit of personality.
Yeah.
And I thought that was that's what really attracted me to the story.
It's the flank, I think, as you describe it, if you use rugby analogy in those terms, versus being the slightly more obnoxious number 9 in your face. Who did you ascribe that personality to again? I think PSG was the one.
That was Steinhoff. I thought Steinhoff is that one.
Yeah.
And they always, I don't know if you were a scrum off, but scrum off just always give away penalties.
I was a backline player, but I was more out in the wide channels, wing and fullback, scoring the tries, not getting too involved in the physical stuff. Though I did love it, until I broke my collarbone in Springs on a cricket pitch. But that's a story for another day. Now, when you look at this organization that's been Stalking Giants, and it's a pretty powerful metaphor in the book, I've just got to say that I love the other title, actually, Hey Big Lender. And I don't know what your publisher was on about, because I can't actually get that tune out of my head now. And that was the other title that you had for the book, Hey Big Lender. Really, really catchy. But Stalking Giants, do you think Capitec has fully emerged from the shadows, or do they still potentially see themselves as this underdog fighting against the bigger banks?
Yeah, so having spoken to Gary Fourie about it relatively recently, they see themselves, they almost have this underdog philosophy, and I think they think there's always going to be a giant, a different giant. So the things that worry them now, big tech moving into financial services, or they haven't said this, but I assume big retailers moving deeper into financial services. I mean, if you walk into a shop right and you see a very big money market desk in the one part of the shop. So those are the things that I think should keep them awake. I mean, if telecoms providers manage to get their act together and have people actually use their payment functions in the same way. But, the other side of the coin is also Capitec stalks all of these giants from a different angle. So, if I was Vodacom, I'd probably be quite worried about Capitec Connect. And if I was Sanlam, I would have some sleepless nights about Capitec starting life insurance.
Yeah, that works both ways. Absolutely. But then Time Bank as well. I mean, if you just look at what Time Bank has achieved and its cost of acquisition of new customers, I mean, it is a fraction. I was hosting CEO Konrad Jonker on a panel at Gibbs a couple of months ago, and he was talking like probably 1/10 of the cost of acquisition of the established banks and probably half of Capitec's at the time. Again, because the technology that they used it didn't have the legacy that even Capitec has to deal with, because of that's just the way technology works. As soon as you install a system, tomorrow there's already some legacy that you're starting to deal with. Do you think, this is a highly speculative question, but given the platform that has been laid and the DNA and the culture of this organization, I suppose you wouldn't be betting against Capitec emerging as a winner in whatever fight emerges in this space?
I like highly speculative questions because I like giving highly speculative answers. But I would imagine Capitec I think they're very aware of what everyone else is doing. And I think that the number of eyes they have on things around them, and I think the number of moving parts that they watch, I think that could be the difference. Because you now have an organization with 15,000 employees, but Capitec's the idea of that is everyone needs to pull their weight. And if you look at just the number of IT, data analysis, data scientists, those kind of appointments they've made in the last few years, I mean, it's hundreds, low thousands that they pulled into those teams. And I think there's still a culture of being very nimble and being very clever about the way they do things. And I'd be surprised if TymeBank, I'd be surprised if they're a success. They're obviously already a success. But I'd be surprised if they displace Capitec or they eat too deep into the Capitec client base. Because in South Africa, we do have double counting when it comes to bank accounts.
Yeah.
So if TymeBank's on 8 or 10 million,
how many are active?
Yeah, how many are active and what do people use it for? But I think the interesting thing is that I think they said earlier this year they are now profitable, I think, which is quite extraordinary, I think, for a bank to do in half a decade if they didn't buy 300 micro lending shops and had them churning out cash to start with. But Michael, I think that fight will be very interesting, and I think the more interesting part of it will be how Capitec reacts when it starts maybe feeling the heat from the likes of Time. Because, and I think this is the point that I make in the book, is once you are a giant yourself, you start acting differently.
Yeah.
And that's where Capitec is now. It has a market cap just about the same as Standard Bank, I think.
It really is incredible. And looking at it, what struck me as well reading the book, TJ, is as much as it's about Capitec, it's also really, I felt, quite an indictment on the incumbents, the big four, and their attitude at the time towards a section of the market, and let's not pull our punches here, black majority, and the complete lack of vision to say, well, how could we better service this? Where could they be in time? And I just wonder how many other industries are guilty of this 30 years into democracy, that other entrepreneurs are looking at and saying, right, there's been too much complacency, too much big has bred hubris. And I often wonder where the next big disruption is going to come from. But just as we wrap up though, and to get your concluding thoughts on putting the book together, how do you go through the writing process? Because it's a very easy but very well researched book, very easy to read. You dropped it off on a Sunday. I had it wrapped up by late afternoon on the Monday. In between doing interviews and everything else that I've got to do, I just couldn't put it down. What is your writing process?
I'd like to tell you that it's very structured, and I write every morning, and that's how I do it. But I'm just too much of a journalist. So in the end, there's a deadline, and then a certain number of days before the deadline, I start going. But to be perfectly honest, I found with writing the Christo Wiese book, when I sat down, I gave myself 2 months to the deadline, and I could not get past 1,000 words in the first week or two. That was in total. And I just found that I did not know enough about the topic at the time, even though I had everything, even though I had done my research. I just couldn't find it quick enough. So I sat down and I studied it like a two-week block before an exam. And I found that to be very good, because when I sat down again, I only had a month left then. But when I sat down again, I at least knew where everything was.
Yeah.
And that makes a big difference, because if you doubt yourself on this fact or that thing, it takes longer to go and look it up than just writing it, just writing past it. So sometimes you force yourself to take a shallower approach, and I don't like that. So when I wrote Koersbekker, it was quite different. I actually wrote that chapter for chapter and sent that off to the publisher because I was so long past my deadline. So the second half of that book was chapter for chapter, and I found that to be a good system. And I think that's also why it almost felt a bit more journalistic. Whereas this one, I really can't tell you what the process was. I can just tell you it was incredibly painful. I almost couldn't believe it. It felt like I had learned nothing with the previous 2 books. And now, and I don't actually like the writing that much. I love the research and I love the book launches. Everything in between. Nightmare.
Provided there's good wine, I'm with you on that. By 2023, if you look at it, the number of South Africans outside the formal financial sector had dropped dramatically. What was it? 3.6 million in 2001. which was when Capitec was really birthed, to 17.6 million. How much should Capitec get the credit for in terms of those numbers? Because that is a huge social impact when it comes to deepening financial inclusion.
I think they should get quite a lot of the credit, and not necessarily by things that they did themselves or that people became Capitec clients, but I think they forced everyone else to follow them on certain things. I think if you look at the real cost of banking fees, what it would cost you today in terms of liters of milk or bread, something that you can measure, it costs so much less today to transact than it did in 2001. So I think that definitely made it less of a painful purchase and a painful process for people to just at least have a bank account. The other part of it is they made it understandable. It wasn't as complex. It wasn't those counters of forms that you have to fill in. I mean, to open a Capitec account, you really don't even need to be literate, because it was all paperless. Someone there sits and explains it to you, and you can catch your taxi after that. I think that was quite a revolutionary thing that happened there, that the speed at which they opened accounts, granted loans, and I think it still feeds back into their system today. They measure how long a person is in a branch. They have this data center that they just crunch numbers and there they go, because they know what it costs in terms of overheads for every minute a person is in a branch. And that's their approach.
Adrian Besson of Hungry Lion, the son of Whitey Besson, is taking a very similar approach, data-driven, to the chicken business across Africa. Fascinating story, that one, in terms of understanding dwell time in a fast food QSR type restaurant, but also taking away some of the admin that is a barrier for higher end skills to grow the business into Africa. Data, and again, all out of Stellenbosch, this kind of vision. TJ Strydom, thank you very much. Author of Capitec, Stalking Giants, a book that doesn't just tell the story of a bank, it dives into the cultural shifts, the disruptive innovations, the social impact that made Capitec the five-star banking sensation that it is today. From nothing to 3,000 Rand a share, made millionaires and billionaires out of people. We didn't even get into those stories around Labashe and others. So if you've ever wondered how a bunch of Bolanders in check shirts and blue jeans managed to outsmart the well-heeled suits of Joburg, go grab a copy. TJ, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it.